A voice spoke, quietly, clearly, and impossibly close. "Hello, Noah." Noah's blood turned cold, because he had never heard the voice before, and yet somehow it knew his name. Let's begin with the expression, Noah's blood turned cold. Of course, his blood didn't really become cold. This is a very common English expression. We use it when someone suddenly feels intense fear or shock. For example, "My blood turned cold when I heard footsteps behind me," or "His blood turned cold after reading the message." It's a much more vivid way of saying he became very frightened. Now notice another interesting detail. The voice is described as quiet, clear, and impossibly close. The word impossibly means something seems impossible to believe, so the voice sounds so close that it doesn't seem possible. This immediately creates mystery and makes us wonder where the voice is coming from. And then we read, "It knew his name." That's a very short sentence, but short sentences are often powerful. Why? Because they make us stop and think. If a complete stranger knows your name, you immediately begin asking questions. Who are they? How do they know me? Have they been watching me? That is exactly what the writer wants us to feel. For a long moment, nobody moved. The church seemed to shrink around them. Even the air felt heavier. Noah couldn't bring himself to answer. Every instinct told him that speaking might be a mistake. Now, let's look at the expression "for a long moment." It doesn't literally mean a long amount of time. It simply means the silence felt long because the situation was so tense. When we're frightened, even a few seconds can feel much longer. Next we have, the church seemed to shrink around them. The church isn't actually becoming smaller. This is called descriptive language. It shows us how Noah feels. When people are afraid, the world can suddenly feel smaller, darker, or more crowded, even though nothing has physically changed. Now let's look at another useful expression. Noah couldn't bring himself to answer. This is a very natural phrase in English, and it means he wanted to answer, but emotionally he couldn't do it. For example, she couldn't bring herself to tell the truth, or he couldn't bring himself to open the letter. Notice that it's not about ability, it's about emotion. Finally, the sentence says, every instinct told him that speaking might be a mistake. The word instinct means a natural feeling that tells you what to do without carefully thinking about it. Sometimes people say, my instinct told me to run, or trust your instincts. Native speakers use this word quite often when talking about danger or making quick decisions. Beside him, Ethan remained perfectly still. His eyes never left the entrance. The colour had drained from his face. He looked less like a man expecting danger and more like someone recognizing it. This paragraph tells us a lot about Ethan without saying very much. Let's look at the expression, the colour had drained from his face. This means he became very pale because he was frightened or shocked. It's a common expression in English. For example, the colour drained from her face when she heard the news. Or, his face went pale. Both expressions describe the same idea. Now notice the last sentence. He looked less like a man expecting danger and more like someone recognizing it. There's an important difference between these two ideas. If you're expecting danger, you think something bad might happen. If you're recognizing danger, it means you've seen it before. You know exactly what it is. That small difference tells us something important. Ethan isn't frightened because something unknown has appeared. He's frightened because he already knows what is outside. and that makes the mystery even deeper. The silence stretched until Noah finally managed to whisper, "Who is that?" Ethan didn't answer. His jaw tightened. His breathing became slower, more controlled. Let's look at the expression, "the silence stretched." Silence can't really stretch. This is another natural piece of descriptive English. It means the silence continued for what felt like a very long time. You might also hear people say, "The meeting seemed to last forever," or "the seconds felt like minutes." These expressions show how we experience time emotionally. Now notice the sentence, "his jaw tightened." Your jaw is the lower part of your face that moves when you speak or eat. When someone's jaw tightens, it usually means they're trying to stay calm, hiding their fear or controlling strong emotions. Finally, his breathing became slower, more controlled. Notice the choice of the word controlled. Ethan isn't naturally calm. He's deliberately controlling his breathing so he doesn't panic. People often do this in stressful situations. Taking slow, controlled breaths can help someone think more clearly. And that's exactly what Ethan is trying to do here. As though he were forcing himself not to panic, then the voice came again, still calm, still polite. "You've come much sooner than we expected." Noah frowned. "We?" The word slipped out before he could stop himself. Almost immediately, Ethan shot him a sharp look, a warning. Noah understood it too late. The voice outside laughed softly, not loudly, not cruelly, just enough to let them know it had heard. Let's begin with this sentence, as though he were forcing himself not to panic. The verb force means to make someone do something, but here Ethan is forcing himself to stay calm. In other words, panic is trying to take over, but he's fighting against it. Here's another example. She forced herself to smile. She wasn't happy, but she made herself smile anyway. Or he forced himself to keep walking. Even though he was tired, he didn't stop. Now let's look at the word panic. To panic means to suddenly become very frightened and lose control. For example, "Don't panic. Everything will be all right." Or "the passengers began to panic." It's a very useful word because native speakers use it often. Then the voice came again, still calm, still polite. "You've come much sooner than we expected." Notice how the writer repeats the word still calm, still polite. This repetition slows the story down and makes us pay attention to the speaker's voice. What's interesting is that the voice doesn't sound angry, it sounds calm. Sometimes that's even more frightening. If someone is shouting, you know they're upset. But when someone stays completely calm in a dangerous situation, it can feel much more unsettling. Now let's look at the sentence, "You've come much sooner than we expected." The word sooner means earlier than expected. For example, "You arrived sooner than I thought," or "The train came sooner than usual." It's a very natural word to use in everyday English. But the most important word in this sentence is actually we. The speaker doesn't say, "I expected you." The speaker says, "We expected you." That tiny word tells us something important. There isn't just one person involved. Someone else is waiting, or perhaps many others. Noah frowned. "We?" The word slipped out before he could stop himself. This is a lovely expression to learn. The word slipped out. Here, slipped out doesn't mean something physically fell. It means Noah spoke without planning to. The question escaped before he had time to think. Native speakers use this expression quite often. For example, the truth just slipped out, or I didn't mean to tell her, it just slipped out. It describes speaking automatically without thinking first. Almost immediately, Ethan shot him a sharp look, a warning. Noah understood it too late. Now let's look at the expression, shot him a sharp look. Of course, Ethan didn't shoot anything. This is an idiomatic expression. It means he looked at Noah very quickly and very seriously, usually to warn someone or to show disapproval. For example, my teacher shot me a sharp look when I started talking, or she shot him a look that said, be quiet. Notice that the writer doesn't even need to explain Ethan's feelings. That one look says everything. And then we read, Noah understood it too late. That's another natural expression. It means Noah realized the mistake, but only after he had already made it. Sometimes we also say, I realized too late, or by then it was too late. The voice outside laughed softly, not loudly, not cruelly, just enough to let them know it had heard. This is another clever piece of writing. The speaker doesn't laugh because something is funny. The laugh has a different purpose. It's letting Noah and Ethan know, I heard what you said, without saying those words directly. And notice how carefully the laugh is described, not loudly, not cruelly. It's calm, controlled, almost polite. That makes the voice feel confident. It doesn't need to shout. It already knows it's in control. And sometimes in stories like this, a quiet voice can feel much more frightening than a loud one. You shouldn't answer them, Ethan whispered. They already know enough. Noah swallowed. What do you mean them? For the first time since entering Black Hollow, Ethan hesitated. His thoughts no longer seemed coherent. He opened his mouth, closed it again, looked towards the ceiling as though searching for the right words. Finally he spoke. They don't all think the same. Noah stared at him. I don't understand. I know. Another silence settled between them. Let's begin with Ethan's warning. You shouldn't answer them. Notice that Ethan doesn't say, don't answer. Instead, he says, you shouldn't answer them. The phrase shouldn't is giving advice or a warning. For example, you shouldn't walk alone at night. Or you shouldn't touch that. It's very hot. It sounds calm, but it's serious. Now listen to the next sentence. They already know enough. The word already means something has happened before this moment. For example, I've already eaten, or she already knows the answer. But in this story, the frightening part isn't the word already. It's the word enough. Ethan believes they already have all the information they need, so speaking again might reveal even more. Sometimes saying nothing is the safest choice. Noah swallowed. What do you mean, them? This is another small detail that tells us a lot. When someone swallows, they move the saliva in their mouth down into their throat. Writers often mention this when a character is nervous or frightened. For example, she swallowed before answering the question. Or, he swallowed hard and opened the door. You may also hear the expression, he swallowed hard. It means someone is trying to control their fear or emotions. Now notice Noah's question. He doesn't ask, who? He asks, what do you mean them? He's beginning to realize there is more than one person, or perhaps more than one creature. That single word tells us the mystery is becoming much bigger. For the first time since entering Black Hollow, Ethan hesitated. His thoughts no longer seemed coherent. He opened his mouth, closed it again. Let's look at the verb hesitated. To hesitate means to pause before speaking or acting because you're uncertain. For example, she hesitated before opening the letter, or he hesitated for a moment before answering. Native speakers use this word very often. Now let's learn another useful word, coherent. If someone's ideas are coherent, they are clear, logical, and easy to understand. For example, her explanation was clear and coherent, or he was too tired to give a coherent answer. Here, Ethan's thoughts are no longer coherent. Fear is making it difficult for him to think clearly. Notice what the writer shows us. He opened his mouth, closed it again. The writer doesn't simply tell us Ethan is struggling. Instead, we see it through his actions. That's a wonderful way to describe emotion. Finally, he spoke. They don't all think the same. Noah stared at him. I don't understand. I know. This is a very interesting sentence. They don't all think the same. It tells us that they are different from one another. They don't all share the same ideas or intentions. That creates even more questions. Who are they? How many are there? Can some of them be trusted? Notice Noah's reply. I don't understand. That's a very natural sentence in English. If someone is explaining something difficult, you can simply say, I'm sorry, I don't understand, or I don't quite understand. Adding quite makes it sound a little softer and more polite. Now listen to Ethan's answer. I know. Only 2 words, but they carry a lot of meaning. He isn't criticizing Noah. He isn't impatient. He's simply acknowledging that everything Noah has heard is confusing. Sometimes the shortest replies feel the most natural. Another silence settled between them. This is a beautiful expression. Silence settled. Silence can't literally settle like dust. This is descriptive language. It creates the feeling that the silence slowly fills the room and stays there. You might also hear expressions like, a silence fell over the room, or the room fell silent. These are very common ways to describe a moment when everyone suddenly stops speaking. Outside, the wind gently made the branches sway against the church walls. The scratching sound echoed through the old stone building. For a fraction of a second, Noah convinced himself it was only the trees. Then another sound followed. Not scratching, footsteps, slow, measured, circling the church. Whoever stood outside wasn't waiting anymore. They were walking around the building, looking, searching. The footsteps stopped beneath one of the stained glass windows. Noah instinctively looked towards it. Nothing. Only darkness. Let's begin with the first sentence. Outside, the wind gently made the branches sway against the church walls. The verb sway means to move slowly from side to side. Trees sway in the wind. Tall grass can sway. Even people can sway if they're tired or standing on a moving boat, for example. The trees swayed gently in the breeze, or the flowers were swaying in the wind. It's a calm, gentle movement. But notice something interesting. The movement itself isn't frightening. It's the sound it creates. The branches rub against the church walls, and suddenly an ordinary sound becomes something much more mysterious. The scratching sound echoed through the old stone building. Let's look at the verb echoed. If a sound echoes, it bounces off walls and comes back again. You'll often hear echoes in places like caves, tunnels, churches, or empty buildings. For example, his voice echoed through the hallway, or the shout echoed across the valley. Because the church is old and made of stone, every small sound feels louder. That makes the atmosphere much more tense. For a fraction of a second, Noah convinced himself it was only the trees. This is a lovely expression. A fraction of a second means a very, very short time, almost instantly. For example, the lights went out for a fraction of a second, or she hesitated for a fraction of a second before answering. Now let's look at another useful verb, convinced himself. To convince someone means to make them believe something. Here, Noah convinced himself. In other words, he tried to calm himself. He wanted to believe the sound was harmless. People often do this when they're nervous. They try to find a simple explanation before accepting that something might be wrong. Then another sound followed, not scratching, footsteps, slow, measured. Let's look at the adjective measured. Normally, measured means carefully controlled, not too fast, not too slow, very deliberate. For example, she spoke in a calm, measured voice, or he walked with slow, measured steps. So these aren't hurried footsteps. Whoever is outside isn't running, they're taking their time. That makes the scene even more unsettling. It suggests confidence. Circling the church. Whoever stood outside wasn't waiting anymore. They were walking around the building, looking, searching. Notice how the writer uses very short sentences here. Looking, searching. Each word stands alone. This slows the reading down and allows us to imagine every movement. Now let's look at the verb searching. To search means to look carefully for someone or something. In this story, we don't know exactly what the person outside is searching for, but it certainly feels as though they're searching for Noah and Ethan. The footsteps stopped beneath one of the stained glass windows. Noah instinctively looked towards it. Then a shadow moved across the coloured glass. Not quickly, deliberately, as if the person outside wanted them to notice. Let's begin with the word shadow. A shadow is the dark shape that appears when something blocks the light. For example, I saw a shadow moving across the wall, or the tree cast a long shadow across the road. Now notice the word deliberately. If you do something deliberately, you do it on purpose. It isn't an accident. For example, he deliberately ignored my question, or she deliberately left the door open. Now think about the story. The shadow isn't trying to hide. It moves slowly, on purpose, almost as if the person outside wants Noah and Ethan to know they're there. That confidence makes the scene much more frightening. Ethan quietly reached inside his coat. Noah expected him to pull out a weapon. Instead, he removed a small brass key. Old, but its surface was almost completely unblemished despite its age. No scratches, no rust. It looked strangely untouched by time. "What is that?" Noah whispered. Notice how the writer surprises us here. Noah expects a weapon. A weapon is something used to defend yourself or attack someone, such as a knife or a gun. But instead of a weapon, Ethan takes out a key. That immediately makes us curious. Why is a key more important than a weapon? Now let's learn the word unblemished. Listen carefully. Unblemished. If something is unblemished, it has no marks, scratches, stains, or damage. It looks perfect. For example, the diamond was completely unblemished, or the old table remained unblemished despite its age. Now notice another useful word. Despite. Despite means even though. For example, despite the rain, they went for a walk. So when the story says its surface was almost completely unblemished despite its age, it means the key is very old, but it still looks brand new. Ethan didn't answer immediately. Instead, he closed his hand tightly around it. "This was designated to me." Noah frowned. "Designated?" Let's learn the word designated. Listen to the pronunciation. Designated. If something is designated, it has been officially chosen or assigned for a particular person or purpose. For example, this parking space is designated for staff, or she was designated as the team leader. In this story, Ethan isn't saying he simply owns the key. He's saying it was meant for him. Someone chose him to have it. That makes the key feel much more important. My father gave it to me the night we arrived. His voice became quieter. He told me never to lose it. And did he tell you why? No. The answer came immediately, but I think he knew more than he admitted. Let's look at the verb admitted. To admit doesn't always mean admitting you've done something wrong. It can also mean finally saying something that is true. For example, she admitted she was afraid, or he admitted that he didn't know the answer. Here, Ethan believes his father knew much more about Black Hollow, but chose not to tell him. Sometimes people hide the truth because they're trying to protect someone, or sometimes because the truth is simply too frightening. Notice the sentence, the answer came immediately. That tells us Ethan didn't need time to think. He already knew the answer. His father never explained the reason. Outside, the footsteps began again. This time, faster. Sometimes the writer creates suspense simply by changing the pace. Earlier, the footsteps were described as slow and measured. Now they're becoming faster. That tells us something has changed. Whoever is outside is no longer patiently waiting. They moved from one side of the church to the other, then back again, as though whoever was outside was growing impatient. Let's begin with the verb moved. The footsteps don't stay in one place. They move from one side of the church to the other and then back again. This creates the image of someone walking around the building, almost as if they're searching for a way in. Now let's look at the adjective impatient. If you're impatient, you don't want to wait. You want something to happen now. For example, the children became impatient while waiting for the bus, or he was getting impatient because nobody answered the phone. Notice the phrase, growing impatient. Native speakers often use the verb grow before an adjective. For example, the room grew quiet. She grew nervous. The sky grew darker. So growing impatient means the person's impatience is increasing little by little. That's a very natural expression in English. Suddenly, a loud wailing echoed across the town. Long, painful, almost human. The sound froze Noah where he stood. It seemed to come from everywhere at once. The streets, the rooftops, the woods beyond the church. It rose into the night before slowly fading away. Let's learn the word wailing. Listen carefully. Wailing. A wail is a long, loud cry that expresses pain, fear, sadness, or suffering. For example, the baby began wailing in the middle of the night, or they heard the wailing of the wind during the storm. In this story, the writer says the sound was almost human. That single word, almost, is very important. It makes us wonder, if it isn't completely human, then what made it? Notice the sentence, the sound froze Noah where he stood. Of course, Noah didn't literally turn into ice. This is another common English expression. It means he became so frightened that he couldn't move. You might hear people say, I froze when I saw the snake, or she froze with fear. It's a very natural way to describe sudden shock. Now listen to this beautiful description. It seemed to come from everywhere at once. This means Noah can't tell where the sound is coming from. The streets, the rooftops, the woods. It's as though the whole town is making the sound. That makes Black Hollow feel even more mysterious. Finally, notice the verb fading away. If a sound fades away, it slowly becomes quieter until you can't hear it anymore. For example, the music faded away, or his footsteps slowly faded into the distance. Noah looked at Ethan. "What was that?" Ethan's face darkened. "I was hoping you wouldn't hear it." "Hear what?" "The ones who wander." Let's look at the expression, his face darkened. His face didn't literally change colour. This is descriptive language. It means his expression became more serious, worried, or troubled. For example, her face darkened when she heard the news. Or his expression darkened immediately. Now notice Ethan's sentence, "I was hoping you wouldn't hear it." This is a very natural grammar pattern. I was hoping. Native speakers use it when talking about a hope they had before something happened. For example, "I was hoping you'd come today." "I was hoping the weather would improve." It's softer and more polite than simply saying, "I hoped." Finally, Ethan says, "the ones who wander." Let's look at the verb wander. To wander means to walk without a clear direction or purpose. For example, "we wandered around the old town all afternoon," or "he wandered through the forest all alone." But in this story, the phrase "the ones who wander" sounds much more mysterious. Ethan doesn't call them people. He doesn't call them creatures. He simply gives them a name. And sometimes giving something a name, without explaining what it is, can make it even more frightening. Before Noah could ask another question, something struck one of the church windows. Bang! The stained glass shook violently. Dust drifted from the ceiling. Neither of them moved. Another bang. Closer this time. Harder. Let's begin with the verb struck. To strike means to hit something with force. For example, lightning struck the tree, or something struck the window. It's a stronger word than simply saying hit. Makes the impact feel more sudden and more powerful. Next we read, "the stained glass shook violently." The adverb violently means with great force, not gently, not slightly, very forcefully. For example, "the wind shook the trees violently," or "the door slammed shut violently." The writer wants us to imagine that the whole window is trembling from the impact. Now look at this sentence. Dust drifted from the ceiling. The verb drifted means to move slowly and gently through the air. For example, "the leaves drifted to the ground," or "smoke drifted through the room." Even though something hit the church with great force, the dust falls quietly. That contrast makes the scene even more vivid. Neither of them moved. Another bang, closer this time, harder. Noah instinctively stepped backwards. His foot caught against one of the wooden benches. Notice how the sentences become very short. Each sentence feels like a heartbeat. Another bang, pause. Closer this time, pause, harder. This pacing builds tension because the danger feels as though it's getting nearer and stronger. Now let's look at the word instinctively again. It means Noah reacts without thinking. His body moves before his mind has time to decide what to do. That's a very natural human reaction when we're frightened. Next we read, "his foot caught against one of the wooden benches." Here the verb caught doesn't mean he caught something with his hands. It means his foot accidentally hit the bench and almost stopped him from moving. For example, her foot caught on the step and she nearly fell. Or, his jacket caught on the fence. This is a useful expression because it often appears when someone is moving quickly or isn't paying attention. The church, which had felt peaceful only minutes earlier, had fallen into complete disarray. Benches seemed crooked. Let's learn a wonderful word here, disarray. Listen to the pronunciation. Disarray. Disarray means everything is untidy, disorganized, or in chaos. Native speakers often use the expression in complete disarray. For example, after the storm, the garden was in complete disarray, or his office was always in complete disarray. Notice that the writer doesn't simply say the church looked messy. The phrase complete disarray creates a much stronger picture. Everything feels as though it's out of place. Finally, let's look at the adjective crooked. If something is crooked, it isn't straight. It may be leaning to one side or sitting at an odd angle. For example, the picture on the wall is crooked. Or the old fence was crooked after the storm. Here the benches haven't necessarily moved. But because Noah is frightened, everything around him suddenly feels wrong. That's another clever piece of descriptive writing. Sometimes fear doesn't just change how we feel, it changes how we see the world around us. Loose papers scattered across the stone floor. Candles trembled as cold air slipped through unseen cracks. Everything that had once appeared orderly suddenly looked as though chaos had quietly taken over. Let's begin with the verb scattered. To scatter means to spread things in different directions. For example, the wind scattered the leaves across the garden, or the papers were scattered all over the floor. Instead of being neatly piled together, the papers are now everywhere. It's a small detail, but it helps us imagine how disturbed the church has become. Now look at this sentence. Candles trembled as cold air slipped through unseen cracks. The verb trembled means to shake with very small movements. People can tremble because they're cold, frightened, or nervous. For example, her hands trembled with fear, or his voice trembled as he spoke. Here it's the candle flames that are trembling because of the cold air. Now let's look at another useful verb, slipped. To slip means to move quietly and smoothly. For example, the cat slipped through the open door, or a ray of sunlight slipped through the curtains. The cold air doesn't rush into the church, it slips through tiny cracks so quietly that nobody notices it at first. Everything that had once appeared orderly suddenly looked as though chaos had quietly taken over. This is a beautiful sentence. Let's begin with the adjective orderly. If something is orderly, it's neat, organized, and in the right place. For example, her desk was always neat and orderly, or the books were arranged in an orderly way. Now compare that with the word chaos. Chaos means complete confusion or complete disorder. For example, the streets were in chaos after the storm, or the classroom descended into chaos. Notice something clever. The writer says, chaos had quietly taken over. Of course, chaos isn't a person. It can't literally take over. This is descriptive language. It creates the feeling that disorder has slowly spread through the church without anyone noticing. The voice outside returned. You don't belong with him, Noah. Its tone remained calm, almost friendly. You've misunderstood your purpose. Now let's look at the verb misunderstood. If you misunderstand something, you understand it incorrectly. For example, I think you misunderstood my question, or she misunderstood what he meant. Noah looked at Ethan. What purpose? Ethan shook his head firmly. Don't listen. But it knows my name. It knows everyone's name. This is a very natural conversation. Notice Ethan's reply. Don't listen. He's giving a warning. He isn't trying to explain. He simply wants to ignore the voice. Now listen to Noah's response. But it knows my name. That's a very reasonable question. From Noah's point of view, it's impossible to ignore someone who knows personal information about him. Then Ethan says, it knows everyone's name. This is a very short sentence, but it changes everything. If the voice knows everyone's name, then Noah isn't special. Whatever is outside seems to know every person who enters Black Hollow. Another pause. Then the voice laughed again. I see Ethan hasn't told you everything. Noah's breathing quickened. He looked back and forth between the heavy church doors and Ethan. Let's look at the verb quickened. If something quickens, it becomes faster. For example, her heartbeat quickened. Or his breathing quickened as he started to run. Here, Noah's breathing becomes faster because he's anxious and confused. Now notice the expression, he looked back and forth. This means he kept looking from one thing to another. For example, she looked back and forth between the two choices. Or the child looked back and forth between his parents. The uncertainty was becoming unbearable. Ethan, tell me the truth. For several seconds, Ethan remained silent. Then he nodded once. You deserve that. Let's begin with the word uncertainty. Uncertainty means not knowing what is true or what is going to happen. For example, there was a lot of uncertainty about the future, or living with uncertainty can be very difficult. Now look at the adjective unbearable. If something is unbearable, it is so difficult, painful, or uncomfortable that you feel you can't endure it anymore. For example, the heat was unbearable, or the silence became unbearable. He slowly walked towards the altar. From beneath it, he pulled out a wooden box Noah hadn't noticed before. It was wrapped in faded cloth, bound with thin leather straps. The box looked as though it had been hidden there for decades. Ethan carefully untied the straps. Let's learn the word altar. An altar is a special table at the front of a church. It is an important place used during religious services. Next, we have the verb wrapped. To wrap something means to cover it with another material. For example, she wrapped the present in colourful paper, or he wrapped a blanket around his shoulders. The writer also says the box was bound with thin leather straps. Here, bound means tied securely. It tells us someone wanted to keep the box safely closed. Finally, notice the phrase, hidden there for decades. A decade means 10 years. So if something has been hidden for decades, it has remained hidden for a very long time. I've avoided this moment for years. What is it? Instead of answering, Ethan opened the lid. Inside lay dozens of small photographs. Every single one showed different people, young, oldies, children, travellers. Some smiled, others looked frightened. Notice Ethan's sentence. I've avoided this moment for years. The verb avoid means to stay away from something or choose not to do it. For example, he avoids difficult conversations, or she tried to avoid making the same mistake. What are these? Ethan picked up one photograph. They're the people Black Hollow remembers. Noah examined the nearest picture. His heart stopped. Every photograph had something written neatly across the bottom. Not names, dates, arrival dates, departure dates. Let's begin with the verb, examined. To examine means to look at something very carefully. For example, the doctor examined the patient, or she examined the map closely. Now, look at the word arrival. Arrival is the moment someone reaches a place. For example, the train's arrival was delayed, or we'll wait for your arrival. The opposite is departure. A departure is the moment someone leaves. For example, the departure time is 9 o'clock, or our departure was delayed because of the weather. These are useful words you'll often see in airports, train stations, and travel information, except many had no departure at all, only arrival. What does that mean? Ethan looked directly into Noah's eyes. It means they never left. Before Noah could respond, a sudden crash echoed from the back of the church. Both men spun around. One of the old cellar doors had burst open. Not completely, just enough to reveal darkness beneath. Let's look at the noun cellar. A cellar is a room underneath a building. People often use it to store food, boxes, or old belongings. Now, notice the phrasal verb burst open. This means something opens suddenly and forcefully. For example, the door burst open, or the pipe burst open during the winter. A cold draught poured into the church. Then something moved. A pale hand slowly crawled out from the opening. Its fingers gripped the wooden floor. Another hand followed. Let's learn the word draught. A draught is a current of cold air that enters through a small opening, such as a window or a crack in the wall. For example, there's a cold draught coming through the window, or I could feel a draught under the door. Now, look at the verb crawled. To crawl means to move very slowly on your hands and knees or with your body close to the ground. For example, the baby crawled across the floor, or the spider crawled up the wall. In this story, the slow movement makes the scene much more frightening. Finally, notice the verb gripped. To grip means to hold something very tightly. For example, she gripped the handrail, or he gripped the steering wheel. The figure isn't touching the floor gently, it's gripping it with strength. Noah couldn't breathe. The figure pulled itself forward inch by inch, slowly, patiently, as though climbing from somewhere far below the church. Ethan whispered only one word: run. Let's finish with the expression inch by inch. An inch is a small unit of measurement, but the expression inch by inch doesn't simply describe distance. It means something happens very slowly, little by little. For example, the traffic moved inch by inch, or he climbed the mountain inch by inch. The writer wants us to imagine every tiny movement. Nothing happens quickly. The figure keeps coming closer, one small movement at a time.